The End of the Affair is a 1951 novel by British author Greene, as well as the title of two feature films released in 1955 and 1999 that were adapted from the novel. Set in London during and just after the Second World War, the novel examines the obsessions, jealousy and discernments within the relationships between three central characters: writer Maurice Bendrix, Sarah Miles, and her husband, civil servant Henry Miles. Greene's own affair with Catherine Walston formed the basis for The End of the Affair. The British edition of the novel is dedicated to C, while the American version is made out to Catherine. Greene's own house at 14 Clapham Common Northside was bombed during the Blitz. 1. The End of the Affair is the fourth and final of Greene's Catholic novels tetralogy, following Brighton Rock 1938, The Power and the Glory 1940, and The Heart of the Matter 1948. Synopsis. Edit. The novel focuses on Maurice Bendrix, a rising writer during the Second World War in London, and Sarah Miles, the wife of an impotent civil servant. Bendrix is based on Greene himself, and he reflects often on the act of writing a novel. Sarah is based on Greene's lover at the time, Catherine Walston, to whom the book is dedicated. Bendrix and Sarah fall in love quickly, but he soon realizes that the affair will end as quickly as it began. The relationship suffers from his overt and admitted jealousy. He is frustrated by her refusal to divorce Henry, her amiable but boring husband. When a bomb blasts Bendrix as flat as he is with Sarah, he is nearly killed. After this, Sarah breaks off the affair with no apparent explanation. Later, Bendrix is still racked with jealousy when he sees Henry crossing the common that separates their flats. Henry has finally started to suspect something, and Bendrix decides to go to a private detective to discover Sarah's new lover. Through her diary, he learns that, when she thought he was dead after the bombing, she made a promise to God not to see Bendrix again if he allowed him to live again. Greene describes Sarah's struggles. After her sudden death from a lung infection brought to a climax by walking on the common in the rain, several miraculous events occur, advocating for some kind of meaningfulness to Sarah's faith. By the last page of the novel, Bendrix came to believe in a God as well. Maurice Bendrix, who is both the protagonist and narrator of The End of the Affair, notes that this story is a record of hate far more than of love. One cold and rainy night, Bendrix walks out of his apartment with the intention of going to a nearby pub. He catches sight of Henry Miles standing alone in the rain, and even though he hates Henry, Bendrix greets him. Henry, on the other hand, appears enthusiastic about seeing Bendrix, noting that he hasn't seen Bendrix in quite some time and implying that any hatred between the two is entirely one-sided. Bendrix asks Henry about his wife, Sarah, simply because it would seem unusual not to. Bendrix thinks to himself that he would be thrilled to hear that Sarah is unhappy and sick because learning that she is suffering would diminish his own suffering. Henry tells Bendrix that Sarah has gone out for the night. Bendrix invites Henry to accompany him to the pub for a drink. Henry agrees, and they walk to the nearest one. At the pub, Bendrix and Henry each order a rum, and Bendrix thinks back through the years to remember how he originally got to know Henry and Sarah. In 1939, Bendrix had been writing a novel that featured a civil servant as the protagonist. He invited Sarah out to lunch to ask her questions about Henry, who was a secretary at the Ministry of Home Security. From there, they began a friendship. Eventually, Bendrix told Sarah about his book and that he was using Henry as source material for Foolish Character, who was the book's comic relief. Sarah, who was fiercely loyal of Henry, immediately hated the book. From then on, Bendrix would purposely ask Sarah questions about Henry to tease her even though it made her cry. Back in the present, Henry tells Bendrix that he is worried about Sarah. Bendrix asks Henry if Sarah is ill, but Henry tells him that he doesn't think so. Henry invites Bendrix back to his house to talk somewhere quieter and more private. Once there, Henry shows Bendrix a letter with a recommendation for a discreet, private detective, implying that he has suspicions about Sarah's faithfulness and has looked into hiring a private detective to follow her. When Bendrix offers to save Henry the embarrassment by going to the detective, Mr. Savage, himself, Henry insists that it can't be done and burns the paper with Mr. Savage's address. Just then, they hear Sarah come inside. Henry tells Sarah she'll die of a cold because she's soaked through from the rain. In a narrated aside, Bendrix wonders if anything in his and Henry's feelings of distrust and hate would have changed if they'd known just how true Henry's statement was. Several days later, Bendrix goes to see Mr. Savage. During their interview, Bendrix tells Mr. Savage that he and Sarah had an affair but haven't been together since June 1944, about 2 years before the current time. When Mr. Savage expresses surprise, Bendrix asks, "Can't one love or hate as long as that?" Mr. Savage notes that jealousy is the mark of true love, and arranges to have a man follow Sarah and provide Bendrix with weekly reports of her whereabouts. Back at home, Sarah calls Bendrix and asks him to meet her for lunch because she has something to talk to him about, and Bendrix agrees. At a restaurant called Rules, which they used to frequent together, Sarah tells Bendrix that she's worried Henry is lonely and asks Bendrix to talk to him every once in a while. Bendrix expresses surprise that Henry is lonely with Sarah around, and she reminds Bendrix that Henry hasn't really noticed her for years. Bendrix pays the bill and they leave the restaurant, stopping at the grating where they shared their first kiss years before. Bendrix moves towards Sarah as if he might kiss her again, but just then she has a coughing fit, the second one during their afternoon together. Bendrix coldly tells her to get her cough checked out, and they go their separate ways. Back at home, Bendrix thinks about his past relationship with Sarah. Throughout much of their relationship, Bendrix had been able to maintain his usual writing schedule. Once he realized how much they were arguing and that their relationship was doomed, however, Bendrix struggled to write anything. Bendrix's landlady interrupts his thoughts, informing him that a man named Mr. Parkus wants to talk to him. When he enters, Mr. Parkus introduces himself as Mr. Savage's man, there to provide the Bendrix with first report. As he reads the report, Bendrix realizes that Mr. Parkus had been watching him and Sarah have lunch, although Mr. Parkus hadn't recognized Bendrix. When Bendrix tells him about it, Mr. Parkus feels humiliated and worries about what he'll say to his son, Lance, about it. Even though Bendrix tells Mr. Parkus to just tell a different story to explain the mistake, Mr. Parkus insists on admitting the mistake to Lance. As Mr. Parkus leaves, Bendrix realizes that he was, for once, briefly distracted from thoughts of himself and Sarah because he was so interested in Mr. Parkus's dilemma. Alone, Bendrix thinks about the first days of his affair with Sarah. Shortly after their first kiss, they had gone to see a movie that was based on one of Bendrix's books together. After that, they got lunch at Rules before deciding to go to a hotel together. After awkwardly having sex for the first time, they went back to Sarah's house and held each other in the parlor while Henry worked in another room. When Bendrix mentioned that Henry could walk in on them without warning, Sarah told him there was a squeaky stair that would alert Henry's presence. Later, when Sarah walked Bendrix to the door, she told him that it would be better if she called him rather than vice versa. This forethought made Bendrix realize that Sarah had carried out other affairs in the past. A short time later, Bendrix went to Sarah's house to see her while Henry was sick in bed, and they had sex on the floor of her parlor. When Sarah climaxed, she told Bendrix that Henry had never gotten her to do so in their 10-year relationship. This explained why Sarah had turned to extramarital affairs, sexual satisfaction and fulfillment. Back in the present, Mr. Parkus sends Bendrix a report that he had followed Sarah to a private residence on Cedar Road, where she appears to spend a lot of her time. Mr. Parkus also sends a scrap of a love letter, in which Sarah had written, "I want to abandon everything, everybody but you, but it's unclear who you is." After reading the letter, Bendrix enters a downward spiral of jealousy and remembers all the arguments he and Sarah had about his jealous nature during their relationship. A few days later, Bendrix receives another report about Sarah going to the same address on Cedar Road. For Bendrix, this seems like confirmation that Sarah is romantically involved with someone else, and he writes to Henry telling him that he has important information to share. When he and Henry meet for lunch a short time later, Bendrix reveals that he hired Mr. Savage and, as a result, has evidence that Sarah is having an affair. When Bendrix tries to give Henry the reports and evidence, Henry throws them into the fire instead of reading them and then storms out of the building. When Bendrix catches up with Henry, Henry asks him if he and Sarah had also had an affair. Bendrix confirms that they did and explains that Sarah has affairs because Henry is a bore and a fool. Henry asks Bendrix why the affair between him and Sarah ended, and Bendrix says it's because their love simply reached its conclusion. Bendrix thinks privately about how his affair with Sarah really ended. The final night of their relationship coincided with the first night of the V1 bombings in London in 1944, shortly before the end of World War II. Bendrix and Sarah were in bed together when they heard the air raid start, and Bendrix got out of bed to go see if they needed to head to the bomb shelter in the basement. Shortly after Bendrix left the room, a bomb destroyed part of his building. The blast shattered nearly all the windows except the stained glass window on his door, and it knocked Bendrix unconscious. Alarmed by the blast, Sarah went to find Bendrix and discovered his lifeless body trapped under a door. Frightened, Sarah ran back to Bendrix's room where she uncharacteristically prayed to God, making a deal that if God would let Bendrix live, then she would end her affair and return to her husband. Just then, Bendrix walked back into his room with only minor injuries, and Sarah promptly went back to her house even though Bendrix begged her to stay. After Sarah left, Bendrix tried to call and write to her to no avail. Sarah had gone away with Henry to the country, and Bendrix didn't see or hear from her again for 2 years. Back in the present, Mr. Parkus has unearthed 2 important pieces of information. First, he's discovered that the name of the man Sarah is visiting is Richard Smythe. More importantly, Mr. Parkus was able to steal Sarah's diary, which he now gives to Bendrix. In the diary, Bendrix reads about Sarah's promise to God and subsequent spiritual struggle. Sarah had always been indifferent about whether God existed, but after the supposed miracle of Bendrix coming back to life, she began to believe. Bendrix also learns that Mr. Smythe is an atheist who Sarah hoped could talk her out of believing in God so she could break the vow and return to Bendrix. Throughout the diary, Sarah wavers between her belief in God and desire to be with Bendrix. After reading this, Bendrix calls Sarah and tells her that he's coming for her, even though she asks him not to. When Bendrix arrives, Sarah, who is seriously ill, runs out into the rain to escape him. Bendrix catches up with Sarah when she stops at a church and tells her about reading her diary. He tells Sarah to go back home and rest. As soon as she's well, they can run away together. A few days later, however, Sarah passes away. After Sarah's death, Bendrix finds a letter she wrote him days before she passed away. In it, she tells him that she can't run away with him because of her marriage and belief in God. This enrages Bendrix, who begins lashing out at God for preventing him and Sarah from being together. Henry, who has since forgiven Sarah for her affairs, asks Bendrix to help him plan the funeral. Father Crompton, a Catholic priest, reveals that Sarah had been interested in Catholicism, but Bendrix talks Henry out of giving Sarah a Catholic funeral. After Sarah's funeral, Mrs. Bertram, Sarah's mother, reveals that Sarah was secretly baptized as a toddler, further complicating the idea that Sarah was truly atheistic. Bendrix, a self-proclaimed atheist, begins grappling with a budding belief in God. Even though it is painful, Bendrix fully accepts that God is real because God had been strong enough to lure Sarah away from him. In the end, Bendrix prays to God to simply leave him alone forever, since love is too painful. Summary analysis. The narrator states that a story has no beginning or end, but that we, arbitrarily, choose a moment from which to look back or from which to look ahead. Despite this, the narrator wonders if he really has chosen the moment from which to begin this story, or if that moment chose him. The narrator also notes that if he had believed then in a God, then he might have believed that it was God who prompted him to go talk to Henry Miles. The narrator did this even though he hated Henry, and even though Henry would soon start hating the narrator, as well. In fact, the narrator notes that this is a record of hate far more than of love, and assures the audience that if he writes one good thing about Henry or his wife Sarah, then it is proof of his trustworthiness. The narrator reveals 2 very important ideas here. First, he believes that he was not entirely in control of his decisions, shown by his description of an outside force, perhaps God, that prompted him to talk to Henry. Second, the narrator is anxious for the audience to believe that he is full of hatred and resentment, which is clearly seen in his insistence that this is a record of hate far more than of love. The latter half of that statement, more than of love, however, also prepares the reader to encounter love, albeit a love that has soured into hate for reasons yet to be explained. Themes. The narrator, whose name is revealed to be Bendrix, says that it was strange to see Henry out that night because it was so rainy, and Henry loved to be comfortable. The narrator, on the other hand, prefers discomfort and so had chosen to walk out into the rain to go to a nearby bar for a drink. On his way out of the building he lives in, Bendrix spots Henry standing alone in the rain. Instead of avoiding him and walking by unnoticed, Bendrix calls out to Henry, who affectionately returns the greeting. Bendrix asks about Sarah simply because it might have seemed odd if he hadn't, although he also notes that nothing would have pleased him more than to learn that she was sick, unhappy, dying, because it would lighten his mind. In his alleged hatred for Sarah, Bendrix wants to hear that something is wrong with her because that would mean that he's not the only one suffering. When Bendrix notes that it would have seemed odd of him not to ask about Sarah, he also begins laying the groundwork for their relationship. It sends the message that all three of them had openly been friends at one point, making it perfectly natural and expected for him to ask about her. This means that, whatever Bendrix's relationship with Sarah was in private, in public they were friends. Themes: love and hatred theme icon, adultery, deception, and honesty theme icon. Henry tells Bendrix that Sarah is out somewhere, which reminds Bendrix of a time when other people might have asked Henry where Sarah was and only he, Bendrix, would have truly known where she was. Bendrix invites Henry out for a drink and is somewhat surprised when Henry agrees, because they've never had a drink together outside of Henry's home. Henry notes that it's been a long time since he or Sarah has seen Bendrix, to which Bendrix replies that the last time they saw each other was in June of 1944, over a year ago. While they're talking, Bendrix thinks to himself what a fool Henry is for not seeing anything odd in the fact that they haven't seen each other in over a year even though they live in the same square. Bendrix calls this failure to see anything suspicious Henry's blinkers, and he notes that he, Bendrix, hated his blinkers even when I had benefited from them, knowing that others could benefit too. Bendrix asks Henry if Sarah is at the movies and Henry says that she isn't and actually doesn't go very much anymore. Bendrix says that she used to. At the bar, Henry and Bendrix each order a rum. While they sit at the table together, Bendrix thinks to himself that he would never even have tried to get to know Henry or Sarah if, in 1939, he hadn't started writing a book about a civil servant. Bendrix remembers that he first started seeing Sarah to ask her questions about Henry's lifestyle, and these questions are what led their friendship. Henry was an assistant secretary in the Ministry of Pensions, and eventually Bendrix told Sarah that he was only interested in Henry as a copy for a ridiculous, comic character in his book. Bendrix notes that this is when Sarah, who was always loyal to Henry, began to hate his book and would cry whenever Bendrix would ask her questions about Henry. Themes: after Bendrix and Henry exchange pleasantries about the past Christmas and Sarah's health, Henry offers to go get them each another rum and Bendrix runs to the restroom. In the restroom, Bendrix sees some crude graffiti about the landlord's wife and, when he returns to his seat, tells Henry about it. Henry notes that jealousy's an awful thing. Bendrix is confused and asks Henry what he means, so Henry tells him, when you are miserable, you envy other people's happiness. Bendrix is privately taken aback at Henry's words and states that, by expressing this private surprise, he is writing in a bitter way. Bendrix asserts that, if he could, he would write with love, but also that if he could do that then he wouldn't be himself anymore. Themes: Bendrix asks Henry if he is miserable and Henry responds that he is worried. Bendrix encourages Henry to explain what he means and privately wonders if it's the rum that's prompting Henry to open up or if he has some idea of how much Bendrix knows about him due to his relationship with Sarah. Henry tells him that he's worried about Sarah, but just then a little hilarious man runs in and makes a lot of noise. Henry tells Bendrix they should go back to his house to talk some more. Themes: once home, Henry calls out to see if Sarah is back yet. There is no answer, so Henry invites Bendrix into his study to talk. Bendrix realizes that this is the first time he'll have been in Henry's study. Bendrix looks around the house as they walk, noting how unusual it is that there is an absence of any token of past taste or past sentiment, and that everything looks unused. In his office, Henry offers Bendrix a whiskey and Bendrix, noting how red Henry's eyes are, wonders if Henry is drinking too much and asks him what's wrong. When Henry answers, Sarah, Bendrix wonders to himself if this would have scared him just 2 years ago. He decides that, actually, he would have welcomed the open fight, because he might have won. Themes: Bendrix asks Henry what exactly it is that he's worried about and Henry shows him a letter. Bendrix, worried it might be one he wrote to Sarah, takes it and reads it. The letter contains a response to a request for information about a discreet, private detective. Bendrix tells Henry that he doesn't understand, so Henry tells him that he had made the request but hasn't done anything. Henry also implies that he can trust Sarah not to read the letter, which he keeps out in the open, but that there's something he can't trust her not to do or be doing. Henry asks if Bendrix thinks he's a fool and Bendrix tells him that he's not a fool. He adds that it is possible because Sarah's human, but also assures Henry that he's not saying anything against Sarah, just that there is nothing foolish in the idea. Themes: Henry asks Bendrix what he should do and Bendrix tells him to either burn the letter or see the private detective, Mr. Savage. Henry, however, swears he can't do either thing. Burning the letter is impossible and he can't go to Mr. Savage because it will make him look ridiculous. At this, Bendrix gives in to his desire to tease Henry and offers to go see Mr. Savage himself. Henry is surprised but grateful for Bendrix's offer, but ultimately tells him the idea is too far-fetched and can't be done. Bendrix tells him that this, like adultery or theft or running away from the enemy's fire, can be and is done every day in modern life. Henry tells Bendrix that he only needed a proper talk, and burns the letter, telling Bendrix to forget it. Themes. Just then Bendrix and Henry hear someone come in. Henry says it must be the maid, but Bendrix insists that it's Sarah they hear. Henry goes to the door and, automatically his face falls into absurd lines of gentleness and affection, as he calls to Sarah. Sarah walks over to them and Bendrix, noting that this is one of the moments of hate, asks her if she's been out walking. Sarah says she has been walking and Bendrix observes how bad the weather is, while Henry notes that Sarah is soaking wet and will catch her death of cold. Bendrix wonders if, even if they had known he spoke truth, they would have felt any genuine anxiety for her, strong enough to overpower their nerves, distrust, and hate. Themes. Over the next few days, Bendrix keeps vigil outside of Henry and Sarah's house, hoping to see Sarah come out. Bendrix notices that Henry never walks across the common anymore and wonders if he's embarrassed about having openly admitted his suspicions of Sarah's behavior. When he's not keeping vigil, Bendrix tries to write his next novel, but he has trouble getting the characters to come alive. Furthermore, Bendrix says there was a hate and suspicion, and a passion to destroy that went deeper than the book. To that end, Bendrix decides to get in contact with Mr. Savage. Even though it had been nearly 2 years since Bendrix had seen either Henry or Sarah, his conversation with Henry and seeing Sarah again immediately sends Bendrix on a downward spiral of jealousy and obsession that reflects the jealousy he felt during his relationship with Sarah. Furthermore, Bendrix is so consumed by his hatred for Sarah and Henry that his work is suffering, highlighting the self-destructiveness associated with jealousy and hatred. Themes. Love and hatred theme icon, jealousy and passion theme icon, adultery, deception, and honesty theme icon. At Mr. Savage's office, Bendrix is shown into one of the 2 waiting rooms. When Mr. Savage comes in, Bendrix notices that he has a receding hairline and a shaved face. A peculiar movement of his fingers when he shakes Bendrix's hand makes Bendrix think he must be a Freemason. Mr. Savage's head, Bendrix notes, glistens like a beacon light of understanding, sympathy, anxiety to be of service. Bendrix is driven to Mr. Savage by his jealousy of whomever Sarah is seeing, if Henry is correct in his suspicions, that is. Mr. Savage's entire appearance is geared toward comforting the jealous men and women who come to see him. He seeks to convey, through his appearance, the impression that he can put an end to their jealousy by uncovering the truth. Themes. Jealousy and passion theme icon. When Bendrix is invited to sit in a comfortable chair and tell Mr. Savage to explain everything, Bendrix begins to feel embarrassed and bitter. Bendrix asks Mr. Savage what the charges are for watching. Mr. Savage tells Bendrix not to worry about that and that, if he wants, Bendrix can leave the office right then without being charged 3 guineas for a preliminary consultation. Before he begins sharing details, Bendrix notes that he is aware that Mr. Savage probably already knows what he's going to say, since this case is no different than the dozens of others Mr. Savage has been hired to take care of already that year. Even though Bendrix says there's not much evidence, Mr. Savage tells him that all he needs is the mood, the atmosphere, and guesses that Bendrix is talking about his wife. Bendrix tells him that he's there about a friend's wife. Mr. Savage asks him if he and the lady are intimate, and is surprised when Bendrix reveals that he's only seen her once since 1944. When Mr. Savage expresses confusion, Bendrix asks, can't one love or hate as long as that? Bendrix also assures Mr. Savage that he is just a jealous person like Mr. Savage's other clients. Mr. Savage assures him that jealousy is actually the mark of a true love. Bendrix tells Mr. Savage that there's reason to believe that Mrs. Miles, that is, Sarah, is deceiving her husband because she's lying about her whereabouts and keeping secrets. Bendrix provides details about the house, whether they have a maid, and Sarah's age. Bendrix also agrees to receiving weekly reports either in person or on the phone, with Mr. Savage's promise the investigation will be discreet. Bendrix reflects that Mr. Savage's job, the detection of the innocent, is not a respectable trade, and that lovers are usually innocent because they don't believe they're doing anything wrong. Bendrix also thinks about the fact that he used to think love excused everything, too. By the time Bendrix leaves, he notes that he is nearly convinced that all men go through this kind of conversation sometime in their lives. Bendrix reflects on the similarities between his profession as a novelist and Mr. Savage's, including the fact that they both gather potentially meaningless details as part of the process of creating a finished product. This makes Bendrix wonder if, as he thinks back to the night when he met Sarah, he can detect her future lover. Bendrix says he noticed Sarah because she was happy, unlike so many people in the summer of 1939. Furthermore, she was beautiful, engaging, and had told him that she'd read his books without making a fuss over his career. However, Bendrix says he didn't think he'd fall in love with her because she was beautiful, and beautiful women make him feel inferior. According to Bendrix, he has a hard time feeling sexual desire for a woman without feeling either mentally or physically superior to her. Bendrix reveals something very important about himself and the nature of his jealousy in this passage. Even before beginning his relationship with Sarah, he felt insecure about himself when he was with her. This means that in their relationship, whether she recognized it or not, Sarah had the upper hand. Without his usual sense of superiority, Bendrix became insecure and felt that he needed Sarah more than she needed him. This made him jealous, and his jealousy helped propel their relationship toward its tragic end. Themes: jealousy and passion theme icon, adultery, deception, and honesty theme icon. Bendrix reminisces about walking out of the party where he met Sarah and onto the common with Henry, whom Bendrix had met at another party the week before. Bendrix says he hadn't liked Henry a lot as they talked on the common. Bendrix told him that Sarah was charming, and Henry noted that she was a great help to him. In the present, Bendrix thinks to himself, poor Henry, but then wonders why he'd consider Henry poor, when, in the end, Henry proved to have the winning cards of gentleness, humility, and trust. Bendrix says that Henry has the winning cards. The word winning implies that there was some sort of competition going on between them, apparently for Sarah. Bendrix also reveals that he realizes that trust played a big part in why Henry won in the end. Because he was jealous, Bendrix was unable to trust. Bendrix's inability to trust Sarah made them both miserable and drove him to do cruel things to both Sarah and Henry, even after the affair was over. Themes: jealousy and passion theme icon. Once again thinking of the party, Bendrix remembers walking back into the house with Henry and thinking he saw Sarah and another man, separating as though from a kiss, but he noticed that Henry hadn't seen it. However, as Henry learns later, the man was not a lover, but a colleague of Henry's. In the present, Bendrix writes that he would have preferred not to think about these past events, because writing about them seems to bring all of his hatred back. Bendrix observes that hatred seems to operate the same glands as love, and both result in many of the same actions.